So thank you very much for having me here. My name is Sjors van Rijt. I'm the Head of Sustainability Partnerships for Energy and Tech at Shell. That basically means that I head up a group that works with all of y'all, as they say, where I live nowadays, in terms of really tackling the challenges for decarbonization for data. And a little bit further than data, it's tech. So it's telcos, software, data centers, hyperscalers, etc. I think we've had quite a few questions about our booth. So there's a Shell booth right next door, and if you haven't been there, I'd encourage you to visit it. Around why is Shell here? And for those questions, I think I have two things, right? There's good news and there's better news. So not good news and bad news, good news and better news. And the good news is that we've been here for a long period of time. We sponsor OCP. We really believe in the value of OCP and these come-in togethers. And we are, of course, you may have heard my colleague Puneet speak about immersion cooling, about fluids earlier in the day, and we are very much involved in that. And we are, the world's #1 lubricants provider, already for the past 16 years. So this is a very natural place for us to talk about. So, lubricants and coolants, particularly for immersion cooling, of course, is a big part of that. But also the better news, I suppose, is that we are an integral part of this value chain. So if you think about tech and data, we operate data centers. That might come as a surprise to a lot of people, but we have a lot of data from seismic. We have a lot of data, petaflops, petabytes, enormous amounts of data that we go through, and increasingly with the help of AI and other technologies, effectively work to help us not only find new resources and optimize, but also very much look at the energy transition going forward. What is the best place for carbon capture and storage? I'll talk about those things a little bit more in the rest of the presentation, but I just wanted to say, we operate in all these parts of the value chains. We are a customer of many of the companies here, on-prem or in the cloud. We work together, we have partnerships. I've seen IBM there, I've seen Microsoft there. We deliver clean energy to a whole bunch of the companies out here. So again, very much part of the ecosystem, right? If you talk about immersion cooling, I see people here. We have, through Shell Ventures, we've had an investment in immersion cooling already for a number of years in Aspiritas, not only to make that company more successful, but also to learn about the industry and to ultimately, again, look at how can we lift all boats, right? How can we get this rising tide of immersion cooling, which, again, I'll talk about it a little bit later. It could be a step change in data decarbonization going forward. So we're here to be part of the discussion, also to listen. So again, come by the booth. And also just to share a little bit about what we've learned. And some, funny little fact before I go into other things is, take a company like Cumulus that spun out of Shell. You may or may not know Cumulus. Again, it's one of our ventures, but it helps actually tighten the nuts and bolts in data centers to the right sort of level so that things don't overheat and catch fire as they did in a particular place a couple of weeks or months ago now, right? So very much part of this ecosystem. So just wanted to start by saying that. I've got the best slide in the world next. That's this. This basically says, for any Shell presentation, don't invest on the basis of what I say, and don't take any forward statements that I might make as being, the truth going forward. Yeah, if I read it out to you, that's the end of the presentation, so I'm not going to do that. But there you go, that's that. What I wanted to talk about a little bit is, this is not as technical as some of the other presentations perhaps, but it is about the challenge of the energy transition as a whole, and then what does that mean for tech, okay? Now, Shell's been doing scenarios. Again, this is a scenario, right? Don't take these lines as a forward curve necessarily. But we've been doing scenarios since the 1970s about energy. How might energy play out? What is the road to net zero? And what you see here are a couple of charts from a scenario called Sky, which is really our most credible technical scenario for reaching net zero emissions in 2050 for the planet, right? So technically possible, still very challenging. Now, and I just want to focus, maybe highlight two things here. On the chart on the, for you, left-hand side, I suppose, is the energy growth in the world going forward. So you see where it's come from since the 1980s. You see in exajoules, which is a lot of joules, right? At 2020, it's like 400 exajoules-ish. Largely spread between industry, transport, buildings, and then there's non-energy use. Yeah, think of things like chemicals and also, again, lubricants, for instance. So energy that gets used into making something that's a non-energy or movement product. Data centers, technologies tends to sit in the industry part of this, but the really important part here is if you look at the black line, okay, that is growth based on a number of parameters. Think about population growth and all kinds of other things of energy when we do not have further efficiency gains as we've seen them in the past. That's pretty significant for tech as a whole because the efficiency gains have been so monumentous, right? I mean, I was talking to somebody at the booth here earlier, they're saying our new product uses 87% less energy than the last product for the same output. That's fantastic, right? Those are all things we need. But you need to keep that up in order not to end up in that black line scenario. And that scenario that is forecasted here with the, let's say the 500 by 2050 or the 600 by 2050, which will go to 800 exajoules by 2070, is a scenario that counts on those efficiency gains to continue. Okay, so I just want you to remember that. If we then talk about the matching electricity mix that would need, you see here that about a quarter of today's energy mix comes from the electricity. So if you look at the 2020 chart there, right, you see 100 out of the 400, let's say, roughly, okay? Going forward, that will double. Yeah, it will need to double in order to meet net zero emissions. So electricity, but not just electricity, clean electricity, okay? So that's why you see here solar and wind, you know, a bit of biofuels on top, have to carry the larger share of that electricity growth. And again, if you bring that back to tech, you guys have been 10 years ahead of everybody else, pretty much, right? NZD targets back in 2010, you know, 2012, gobbling up a lot of green energy as an industry, which is fantastic, right? But moving forward, and you will start to see this, steel, you know, net zero steel, net zero transport in government packages, things like that. There's going to be a lot of competition for that green energy, and in the meantime, it all has to be built and bought, etc. So that's the other part to maybe just remember. In this particular scenario, that carries most of the growth, but this is the one that gets us closest to net zero emissions 2050. So a couple of implications there for tech. So let's talk about tech a little bit more then. And I shamelessly stole some numbers and worked on them from the IEA because they perfectly timed came out with a report last month that talks about data centers, but also the underlying infrastructure, right, in terms of networks, etc. And I drew a couple of lines from here, yeah. And in reality, these are again scenarios that they go wide, but in order to simplify, I put a couple of those lines there. Now, what you see here is again that tech as an industry has been incredibly good at actually having that red line there go up. This is data load, computations, right? And you could put internet usage there, it's the same curve, the same line, versus energy use and carbon emissions. Yeah, and we won't even now talk about, I'll talk about it in a minute, the other sustainability challenges of data centers in terms of water and, you know, e-waste and recyclable materials, etc. But if you focus for a minute just on carbon, what you see is that this is in a way fantastic, but in a way not so fantastic. The not so fantastic part about it is there's still absolute growth in emissions. And what the IEA is saying, in order to be in line with Paris, by 2030, yeah, that's, I mean, it's when my daughter sort of starts high school or is just finishing high school, whatever, it's close, yeah? By 2030, this needs to be halved. So you're effectively looking at, around the room, companies that are increasing their growth year on year, double-digit percentage. Yeah, and that's fantastic to be in that industry. But at the same time, the CO2 emissions from that have to halve, have to basically be back where they were more or less in 2015. Now that's a massive challenge. So for an industry that's done so incredibly well, the challenge going forward is as big or bigger. And that's talking about scope 1 and 2. Again, right, scope 1, what you do yourself, scope 2, what you buy, scope 3, what your customers then use, right? If you talk about scope 3, wow, that's even way more massive, right? So if you talk about scope 1 and 2, it's challenging enough. So I'll come back to why we're here, right? We're here to be part of that conversation and to try and help. So I'll show a little bit of a slide that we kind of put together on what are all the different elements. And I think some of them are talked about a lot. PUE, everybody gratefully in the industry started to converge on PUE being something that's really important, okay, and then we can work on it, right? But there's a lot of other things still out there that can be worked on, can I say, for us as an industry, with the help of energy companies, but also working together with tech. Because tech is such an integral part of bringing the new energy system forward that we have to work together on this, right? It's not just edge computing, it will also be edge power generation, right? Behind the meter power generation. All of that has to now talk to each other in a system for which tech is absolutely crucial. And that again will drive more growth through AI, more high performance computing, hotter elements, more residual heat, etc. So all of that fits together. And I think if we just focus on corporate PPAs, green core PPAs, that's fantastic, that's a really good start. But there are also things like load management, not just from a data center perspective. I think Google's famous for shifting loads to peak hours in terms of where in the world the grid is greenest at that moment. But for instance, something that Shell does very well is we also manage the load within the grid to go to particular places at a particular time where there's more demand. So there's like those two sides of it that need to work together, and I think energy companies have a really big role to play there as well together with you. I mean, immersion cooling, I think I've been here now for 2 days. That's pretty much what everybody's been talking about. So there's a stand right there with lots of experts from Shell on immersion cooling. Please go by and talk about that. I personally believe it's one of the few possible step changes in driving that curve, down to where it needs to be. So it's incredibly important, and the people before here on the stage also talked about that. I've heard Intel talk about that. Everybody is sort of aligned, but it's a really difficult ecosystem from hardware to end customer in terms of hyperscaler to energy providers to manufacturers of silicon chips, etc. And bringing all of that together is again something that we as an energy company actually have a lot of experience in, right? Working with governments, working with regulators. So it's almost a bit of a plea again to come and talk to us about that if that's where you're interested. And it's part of the reason why we're at OCP. Maybe touch upon one other point, which is carbon tracking, carbon emissions. Like, this is all great, but if you can't show what you're doing, then it becomes problematic, right, for your shareholders, but also for regulators, etc. So energy tracing through blockchains, again, the combination between energy and technology, is something else that, as Shell, we're very involved in. And then looking at, what's the lowest carbon blockchain that you can do that on, that still is credible. So we work with the Energy Web Foundation, on these type of solutions as well. Circularity, right? If all the hardware equipment that you see at Schneider Electric is made from bio-based plastics, how great is that, right? Rather than. If you could take your e-waste and dispose of that and perhaps reuse some of those materials, and maybe even reuse some of those waste materials to make new biofuels. Yeah, how great is that? These are all technologies that we not only work on and in some cases have live, right? So these are the coming together of energy and tech. I'll repeat it again, is incredibly important, and I think we are honored to be allowed to be part of that conversation, and we are very happy for you to come by, talk to us, tell us what your problems are, tell us where we can help, and we'll also tell you where our problems are and where we believe we can help each other accelerate the energy transition. So want to thank you very much for that, and hope to see you at our booth.